Good morning, everyone. What a delight to be with you in this conversation. Thank you. As our voice here said, we are excited to engage in a conversation about the future of value. I think before we even get into it, and before we introduce our august panel, it's important to cite us in the fact that this conversation can be quite intellectual, it can be quite philosophical. We can talk about what value means, what wealth means, what kind of society we're building. But it's important that we don't forget the fact that these are integral, intuitive, meaningful questions for every single person on the planet. The topics we're talking about today are not for textbooks. They describe how every individual interacts with their neighbors, their businesses, their governments, how they think about these structures that are created for what it means to live a successful life, a good life, a life of meaning and purpose. And so as we engage in today's conversation, I'll ask us to always keep that in mind. That as we think about how technology is transforming fundamental assumptions about our system, we're also talking about people's lives. And without that frame, we're not really doing anything particularly useful. With that, it's my deep pleasure to introduce this panel. To tell you briefly about myself, my name is Vilas Dar. I'm the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. We're a global philanthropy that thinks about the future of humanity in a technological world. How do we center human dignity, rights, and the ability to live thriving, sustainable lives even as we transform systems? And I'm delighted to be here in a conversation with each of you. I'm going to maybe quickly say your names and titles, but I'll ask you to introduce yourselves. Maybe give us a minute or two, especially for this audience, that tells us about the incredible breadth of your work. And from there, we'll dive into conversation. Joe Raczynski, futurist and technologist for Thomson Reuters. Dr. Susann Roth, Chief of Knowledge at the Asian Development Bank. Duncan Cass-Beggs, Counsellor for Strategic Foresight at the OECD. We're lucky to have each of you. Duncan, maybe I'll start with you. Maybe give us just a couple of minutes on your professional remit. What are the kinds of things that you think about on a daily basis as you do your work?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and greetings, everyone. Delighted to be here. So my title is Counsellor for Strategic Foresight at the OECD. As many of you know, the OECD is a public policy forum based out of Paris, but with really a global mandate to improve public policy. Our motto is better policies for better lives. And my role is really to help bring futures thinking and strategic foresight to inform that work. And we do that by working with all parts of the organization on all the various areas of policy to help them be more proactive in thinking, what could the future look like? What are some of the ways? What are sort of disruptive changes that we should be taking account of in our work? The other role we play is to really lead global collaboration among governments and international organizations and others to conduct foresight together on some of the really most important global challenges that we all face.
Thank you, Duncan. Dr. Roth, maybe we'll come to you next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm the Chief of Knowledge Management at the Asian Development Bank, and my team does three things. We look at corporate knowledge management, which is very interesting for a financial institution. How do you make sure that with money we actually move ideas and knowledge to our developing member country clients? The second area we work on is innovation management. How do we use knowledge and ideas to actually bring new technologies and new ideas for regulation to the forefront and can scale this with government? So my team leads the ADB Innovation Hub. And the third thing is we help government organizations, government agencies to manage their knowledge better. And obviously that is very much needed. As we hear, we need new ways of regulation. We need to make sure we retire old knowledge, we use new knowledge, we bring diversity into this. So that's what I do at the ADB.
We talk about this old adage of knowledge is power. Maybe in today's conversation, knowledge is also wealth. Maybe We'll come back to that theme. Joe, maybe over to you.
Absolutely. Joe Raczynski, I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work for a company called Thomson Reuters. I'm a technologist and futurist, right? So the idea is that I've been in technology for my entire life, since I was a kid, trying to crack into things, open up devices, try to understand how they work at a fundamental level. Over the years, we're starting to see more and more trends, obviously using technology to better people's lives. So my role is really to try to understand what's going on at the forefront of technology, emerging technologies. So I spend a lot of time on AI, most specifically around blockchain. I've gotten involved for better or worse in blockchain via Bitcoin since 2011. Built several currencies in 2017, worked on NFTs, and I'm currently involved in a DAO. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But for me, it's really about understanding the technology and then how it can impact our lives. And so I educate people on these types of topics at the organization.
You can tell why I'm so excited about this panel. We're about to dive into the discussion, but I will let you know that we'll have time for Q&A afterwards, so I'll ask you to think about questions you might want to ask of our experts here. But Duncan, let's jump in. The foundational question to some of this work is, we're talking about a transformation of value. In history, that term has meant a lot of things, but I think it's often distilled down to financial and economic terms. I have a sense that you have a broader vision for us of what we should be talking about. Tell us a bit about it.
Well, thanks very much. Yes, so I think the place to start in a discussion about the future of wealth, the future of value, is to ask, how have we been measuring it so far? How have we been conceiving of it? And where could that go in the future? And as many of you know, the long-standing approach to measuring value and progress has actually been GDP, gross domestic product. It had a number of practical benefits of being simple to measure, simple to understand relatively. But even right from the start, it was understood to be a really imperfect measure of well-being and of progress. And so from the start, there have been a number of other approaches. And I'm proud to say that one of the most important and most rigorous versions of that approach is actually the OECD's own Better Life Index. I encourage many of you to go online and to look at the interactive model they have, which is fascinating because it allows you to actually weigh the different dimensions of this index according to your own views of what should count as most important for defining the better life, and then to be able to see how different countries and different regions perform on those measures. So I think this view of moving actually beyond GDP to ask ourselves what really matters, what do we care about, is fundamentally important, and there's been a lot of work in that. However, as we look to the future, I think this is a space that could grow tremendously. One of the factors driving this is actually just the explosion of data that we're seeing now coming from our various wearables, smartwatches, biometrics, and a number of other measures in our environment. Now, assuming that we can deal with the obviously tremendous privacy challenges associated with this, and this is indeed a huge challenge of our time, but we could imagine a kind of a world where, well, first of all, imagine that you and your own smartphone have got, your smartphone and the AI on it is helping you identify and learn yourself about what really improves your well-being. When is your subjective happiness and psychological well-being most promoted by different activities in your life, and to help you move beyond just sort of the immediate impulses that are rewarding you to actually what is helping you achieve your longer-term definition of your own well-being, and to sort of create a dialogue with you about what that would even mean for yourself. And then, of course, again, privacy concerns acknowledged, how could some of this information be aggregated at the global level, at the broader level for communities and for governments to be able to understand in real time and at scale, to sort of have the pulse on the finger of the actual well-being. So that you're not just putting out quarterly reports about the progress of the economy, but actually understanding how is your society doing, how are they improving. So this is not a technocratic or a data discussion, however. I mean, really what needs to happen as we think about the future well-being is to have a values debate about this. What are the most important things that we care about? How can we actually improve society so that we are making differences on those factors that have the biggest impact on people's well-being in their lives, whether that's their social connections, the density of social connections around them, whether it's the quality of the environment around it, whether it's the impacts of financial insecurity and so forth. How do we actually, if we can understand better what we're trying to achieve and how well we're achieving it, how can we actually achieve that better through public policies and other measures we can take? So that's the first chunk I wanted to mention, but I'm just going to take one other chunk to step back even more broadly to questions about the future of well-being. And that's to make a link with some of the work that we're doing now at the OECD and that others are as well around this question of emerging global existential risks. Now, it's probably obvious that if we're thinking about the future of well-being, a critical factor in that is that we don't inadvertently cause our own extinction, and neither that of our fellow species on the planet. And here things are rapidly advancing in ways that are bringing this attention out of science, this question out of science fiction and into the actual requirement for attention by public policymakers and by all of us in society. As you all know, we've lived now as humanity, it's just really recently in the last century that we've actually created this ability to destroy ourselves with nuclear technologies, arguably with carbon technologies as well. There are some scenarios of climate change that could actually lead to catastrophic or even extinction risk for humanity. But it would be naive or unrealistic to think that that's the last time that we're going to create those kind of risks. And indeed, there are a number of technological developments that experts in the field are raising concern about and suggesting we need to pay more attention to. Really briefly, some of these are around biorisk. I'm sure you're familiar with these. Others are around advanced artificial intelligence, potential for both misuse and misalignment. And then thirdly, we have a bucket sort of unknown unknowns. What are the potential new technologies that can emerge? How would we know if there's something that we really need to pay attention to? So without going into detail now, and many of you will have heard Anders Sandberg speak about this at yesterday's session, but I would say that the overall message is that particularly for you as futurists and as those practicing strategic foresight, this is really an area that we need to pay more attention to. We need to be, of course, helping to create positive visions of the future, aspirations of what we should be striving for and achieving, but we also do need, it is our responsibility to be advising our organizations, our governments, our societies about some of the risks, the crucial, most important risks that they need to be looking out for. I think there's a need for sort of responsible Cassandras, responsible people to be going in and raising the alarm bells about some of these. And so I would encourage all of you to play the role that you can in this. I think that starts with informing oneself about those areas, even though they may be challenging and even scary at times. There's another crucial role, though, is that a lot of these issues are going to really require us to be doing our trade, strategic foresight, looking at many of the different scenarios for how these could play out, and using that to help stress test and future-proof the strategies that we will need to be developing to manage these risks. So just to bring the 2 points together in conclusion, there's actually a fascinating link between defining what we mean by well-being, working collectively to have those discussions about what do we actually care about, what should we be aspiring to as humanity, and then some of these risks, particularly the one relating to artificial intelligence. That is, in AI, there's a big question about the alignment problem. How do we make sure that an increasingly powerful artificial intelligence is actually aligned to human values and human interests? Now, if we actually get that technical question solved, because we don't know how now to make sure that AI would be aligned to our interests technically, but if we ever did, the next huge question is, well, what are those interests? What would human values, human well-being be? What do we want the AI to be helping us to achieve? And that's yet another reason why I think we as strategic foresight practitioners and futurists in particular can be helping to really stimulate and nourish that conversation around what is well-being, what is value, what do we care about, and what should we be caring about in the future under continually changing conditions, and what can we aspire to? So with that, thank you very much.
Duncan, thank you so much for that. What a kind of wide-ranging set of comments that tie us back to this core set of values, right? I think what you have shared with us is when we talk about wealth, it almost sounds like you're saying we should substitute well-being. And I think when we go through these questions and when we come back, I'm going to ask you, I have plenty of colleagues that are in the financial sector, that are in the economic sector, that maybe are similarly situated in terms of intention, but when we ask them what wealth looks like, we might get a very different answer. So I'll ask you to think a little bit about how you might respond to that challenge. But Dr. Roth, let's come to you. I think Duncan has given us one view of what wealth might look like in the future, but in our conversations, you've shared with me that you have a sense of where we should start even asking those questions. Tell us what your kind of intervention on this topic is.
Yeah, so I think to come back to the framing of this panel, right? It was actually about the financial global architecture that we have and the role of financial institutions and how they are actually shaping what we value, and that is obviously wealth and money, to do things with that. And if we should look at technologies that would decentralize that and create different kinds of values. And I think we have to look there at 3 points, right? The first one is money is just a device, right? It's a device to bring people together, to have an interoperable device to make sure people can have transactions with each other. And I think there we have to look back in history, and actually money was used to exchange ideas, right? It was used to travel from one country or continent to another. It was a lot about exchanging ideas, innovations, how are they doing things. So looking from that perspective, we have to change our perspective of money as the tool to change ideas. Now the question is, what should these ideas be for? And that's where we are calling right now actually for a global knowledge architecture, similar to a financial global architecture, where we would have actually global missions. We have one very important one, that is the climate change mission, and we would direct our knowledge and ideas driven and supported by money towards solving these difficult challenges that bring with this mission. So coming back to that, I think there's a lot to learn from international financial systems. We had huge achievements for that. It's stable. There's a certain level of accountability. It's interoperable and it connects people. So if we look now at new technologies, I think there we see the risk of fragmentation, a level of dysregulation, and it could actually disrupt a mission-driven approach to finding better ideas and solutions and bringing different stakeholders together. So I think we should be aware that a lot of things are happening right now in central banks, where we see that central banks are embracing innovative ways to use technology to make actually transactions a lot faster and cheaper. And I think one reason why we saw cryptocurrencies and so on coming out was because people wanted to have cheaper ways to transact money, right? And that came back that actually the current system is quite exclusive. Not everyone can participate. But I think the regulators are seeing that issue. The question is really how fast can they address it? And I hope with the advice of OECD and the IMF and of course the multilateral development banks, we will see progress there. But I think again we have to start with the question: what are central banks there for? What is their mission? That's kind of comes back to green central banking. What do we make sure people exchange money for? Maybe rather than consuming more stuff, which is currently an understanding of value and wealth, is maybe consuming less but having more ideas and exchanging more ideas, and then thinking about how can we make that as efficient and fast and in a way regulated but decentralized as possible.
There's a few things there that we should pull out. One is this idea of wealth as a matter of idea and knowledge transformation. I think that's so important to underscore here, right? Is that these instruments don't exist in some isolation. They exist as part of a system of human interaction. And so as we think about wealth in the future, what I think you're encouraging us to do is to expand our aperture, right? And move beyond money or currency to think about the transfer of value.
Yeah.
But I think you've also made a really important point that, Joe, I'm going to come to you to comment on, which is we're also in a moment in time where all of the mechanisms that we've created in order to do that, particularly in an analog world, no longer seem as concrete, as particularly relevant as they once did. Joe, you sit at the intersection of how new technologies are transforming these fundamental concepts of how we transfer value. Tell us a little bit about where you see this work today and where it goes in the future.
Great question. So I think I should probably preface by saying that I am an absolute eternal optimist and a technologist. So those two together are probably pretty scary, because the things that I might say are, when I start to think about these things, there is an immense amount of opportunity that we all know about, right? There's clearly a lot of things that are going on in the world today that we have to be very concerned about and work our darndest to try to solve. But the enabler for all of this, the reason why we're here, is technology. I've heard several conversations with respect that sort of challenge that it is human first, but technology is what's pushing everything forward. And to that end, when we're talking about this panel and the opportunities that people have around the world that we've never had before, this is the time. We have leapfrog effect. So people that may have never been able to have access to a laptop or a standard desktop, maybe when I was a little kid I had something like that. Clearly not all over the world people did not have that. But now you have devices, Android devices, all over the world that you can buy for $1. Now, yes, can you get access to internet from there? But when you can, what does that enable you to do? All right, everyone's heard of NFTs, right? So these non-fungible tokens, and more than likely you've heard about them because of the Bored Ape Yacht Club or the CryptoPunks, or these pieces of art that you're like, what in the world, why are we even talking about these things? That's the beginning. Now, move that aside. It's an NFT, so basically it's a store of value saying that this particular picture is something that's stored on the blockchain, which allows you to leverage and confirm that that is what that is. So it's a confirmation of something that you can possess. So that's the beginning. If you extrapolate out from that technology, you can now create deeds to property using an NFT, marriage license, deeds to your car, or anything else. 80% of the world is undeeded. People live on land that they do not have a deed for. That's how you develop wealth, is once you're able to prove that, using something like NFT, you can start to move in the direction of developing wealth for people that have never had that before. Opportunities. We all know what happens when you have a little bit of money, you're able to grow, hopefully, from there. There are also other opportunities through NFTs, play to earn. Now, this is sort of a random example, but it gives you an idea of where we can go with this. So there are these opportunities for play to earn, which means that kids all over the world who may have now an Android device they're paying $1 or $2 for, they get internet connectivity maybe from the town or the village that they're able to pool. They play video games, and you're like, what in the world? Maybe my kids do this all day long. They play it for money. They play it to get to a certain level, at which point in time, once they get to that level, they've received a specific NFT that someone like myself may want to have, but it takes such an inordinate amount of time to get there that I then pay for it instead, sort of jumping the line. But it's a model that people are starting to work on right now. That's one way. Second example and last example, then I'll stop talking about technology and how it's going to hopefully solve a lot of problems, is another way of actually generating money or wealth or self-well-being in terms of bringing the ability to contribute to something is again through NFTs, in the sense that now going forward, if you use some of these free open source models to generate AI, so a little bit of code that you've generated yourself, you can create an NFT around that. So it means that going forward, every time that that is used, you could sell it, you can lease it. It's baked into the smart contract so that you can stack a bunch of NFTs on top of each other or algorithms on top of each other. They're all connected such that the person that originally created that can get paid a royalty going forward into perpetuity. That's another way for people to enable a move forward within their own lives, leveraging this sort of technology.
Joe, I'm inspired by all of these examples you have of where this work is happening, but I'm going to push you a little bit on this. I also am a technology optimist, of course, right? And I do think technology can do some really meaningful things. But I have to ask you a fundamental question. You've given us examples of where technology may create value. Tell us how this system engages and forces the idea that these technologies will only do good. Let me give you a little bit more on that question, right? These technologies certainly can do a lot of these things. But the number of people on the planet who know how to create and deploy these technologies is pretty small. Where do you see kind of the intersection between the global wealth frameworks that exist, between the people who are thinking about these foundational questions of creating better tech, and the kind of small community of folks who are actually creators?
So this is what's so fantastic. We're now creating a creator environment, communities. Communities are being built because there's open source available. If you have access to a handheld device, again, very cheap these days throughout the world, not everyone has that, totally understand that, but we're moving in the direction that people will. The applications that sit there that allow for people to leverage that, to use it, are incredible. Once they're able to sort of see this, and we heard about the literacy rate moving up dramatically over the last bunch of years this morning at the keynote speak. The first question that you asked about this was for good. Like, how do we control this such that sometimes things can go askew and people are starting to leverage this for ill intent? It's the same thing that we've always had, the challenges that we've always had with any technology, the internet itself in the very beginning. And I was a little kid when it came out, and I started using bulletin boards before the World Wide Web. And I would go to the World Wide Web bulletin boards initially, play around with those, try to understand that. And then you got to the point of, okay, how do I leverage this? How do I use this? But with anything in technology, there is the use case for good and, of course, the opposite. And so it's up to us as leveraging governments, communities, people, to wrap our arms around that, to deal with those types of issues as we start to see them come up. And they will come up. They're already there.
Dr. Roth, what do you think? You've given us a grounding in the idea that there's kind of a transactional, a critical kind of practical layer to this conversation. Now you're hearing kind of this element of, well, technology will hopefully fix everything. Somewhere in there, I think there's a question, right? And you work in the field of knowledge management, of practices deployed and created, of kind of the best ideas that are out there. How do you see this world evolving?
Yeah. So maybe a few reflections on what Joseph said. But on the first one, I think important is we think about what technologies we have available and what knowledge we have available. And it's actually a question here in the museum is we have to ask ourselves, what was the question? What problems did we want to solve, right? And I think that's why we need something like a global knowledge architecture that defines that helps us to define wealth in the future, right? You said, NFTs, we can actually, gamify this. And actually the Philippines is one of the first countries where they are now, through gamification, through games, are making money. And it's a big topic right now, as you can imagine, as we recover from the COVID crisis. But then it's again back to the values before. It's about making money. I mean, is that making money to buy something that maybe we don't even need? So I think there the question is, how do we create lives and an enabling environment for people to lead psychologically rich lives where they are curious, where they want to solve problems, where they want to have different experiences. And there's actually an interesting research paper out there which showed that around only 17% of people, these are in 3 Asian countries and 1 European country, but the rest of the world have even less people who want to have psychologically rich lives and curious lives to solve problems. Most of the people would like to have happy lives. And as we define happy lives today is about having enough money to consume and to relax and to have a good life, how we define it, right? But that's not going to solve our problems. This will just perpetuate our understanding of wealth, creating more money to buy more things, to consume more things. So I think that's where our knowledge needs to come in. Number one, create more knowledge asset, create opportunities for people to be curious and ask these kind of questions and not just come with, solutions which you might not need. And then create maybe, wealth out of ideas and knowledge and really value knowledge. And, being the chief of knowledge management as at a financial institution is very interesting. Right, where our currency is still providing loans, is the financing that we give to our developing member countries, but actually, in fact, that is changing. There's this changing. The governments would like to have partners to solve the difficult problems, to guide them through this era of uncertainty, to think about the future and the different scenarios, and to bring it back to foresight. And future thinking, which is the topic of this conference, I think this is really our role to play here, right? To guide through these uncertainties, to guide through different scenarios, to use knowledge to inform those, and not just knowledge from the past, but the imagination and the knowledge of the future. So I do hope that knowledge becomes our biggest value as a human society, and that we use that to generate ideas to ensure that we can actually survive.
Wow, to survive. I love it. Dr. Roth, I'm going to stay with you for one more question, and then Duncan, I'm going to ask you to comment on the same one. In your comments, I think we are shaping kind of a broader long-term view of this idea of wealth creation. But I have to ask you quite a practical one today. If I go to a central bank and I say, what are you doing to protect an economic future? They say, we understand the tools we have. We have interest rates, we have inflationary measures, we have all of the tools of macroeconomic policy. But I think you're both advocating for a world in which we integrate a broader aperture of thinking about well-being. And the question quickly becomes, well, who does that? What tools do they use to do it? And what do we do today to equip them to be able to do that for 20 years?
Yeah.
You've already spoken, and this is why I'll come to you for the first part of this question, about how institutions like the Asian Development Bank are asking these questions. But my question for you is, how are they doing, and what do we need to do to accelerate their capacity to do this work?
They means?
Institutions like the ADB.
Okay, and governments, of course. I think what is interesting is when we started Future Thinking and Foresight in the Asian Development Bank around 2016, 17, we did something. I actually totally went out of my comfort zone. I'm a doctor. I'm a surgeon by background, so I also used a lot of knowledge to create my own career and recreate myself. So we went out there and asked our developing member countries if they are interested in future thinking and foresight, to question the systems they currently have and to think about how they can create futures, obviously with financial instruments, with policy that enhance the well-being of their populations. And we started with 11 countries, from Timor-Leste to Mongolia, to Caucasus countries, Armenia, Kazakhstan, so on. It was very interesting because the younger generation of government officials and counterparts was very interested in defining what is well-being and what do we actually want. So it was a very participatory approach, bottom-up, where civil society, citizens, who we engaged in these conversations. And I think it would be very difficult. We need more research, hopefully with OECD, to understand what is the future people really want. And I think it depends a lot also on the perspectives and the backgrounds, obviously, they have. If you speak to someone in Pakistan or Afghanistan, they would like to have peace. Yeah, if you speak to someone in, let's say, rural Philippines, they would like to have electricity and water and an opportunity to get to a hospital in a fairly timely manner and so on. So I think that's also, so we have to understand the perspectives, but then we need, obviously, the futurists who can think about how these perspectives fit into a future that is livable for everyone. And I think what we realized, or what I realized working in these very diverse and different countries over the last 14 years is everyone has a different understanding of well-being and what wealth at the end is, right? I think definitely one area everyone agrees on is wealth is the investment in our children, and in that sense in the future. At least that's what we say. If we live it that way is a different question. And maybe there's a call for all of us and for governments too, is there's a question, how much is the past and maybe the older generation holding the younger generation back? Right? And how do we unlock that through the conversations we have about what wealth is, what do we value, how do we use money, and for what do we use money? Do we use it for experience, for creating opportunities, improving the quality of lives, or do we use it for consuming things and so on? So I'll stop here.
No. I want to come back to that theme, Dr. Roth, of the gatekeepers of our financial and our wealth-based future. But we'll come back to that in a second. Duncan, I want to come to you again for your perspectives on that question. How do we operationalize this new conception of wealth for the future? What do we need to be doing today to allow that 20-year vision to develop?
Well, yeah, fascinating discussion. I think one of the point we're trying to make is, of course, we need to think more broadly of wealth. What does it mean? What do we actually care about, right? I mean, the whole goal of having discussions around values and around well-being are to help us understand, both as individuals and then societies, what really matters. Now, I think if you imagine yourself having a richer understanding of what really actually genuinely leads to optimizing your own well-being, it puts you in a better position to take different actions in your own life. It puts governments in a better position to make policies, but it can also send market signals, right? And I think, if we just look at sort of the boom in the response around mental health that the private sector provided during the COVID crisis, for example, that's a really positive example of how market responses can also adjust in response to people's greater understanding of what they really need. And just imagine if we could see in the coming 100 years the kind of, a parallel improvements in mental health as we've seen in other aspects of physical health over the last centuries and decades. So I think that there are very practical ways in which actually reframing this and becoming far more savvy about well-being means does translate into traditional wealth generation opportunities for the private sector. I just wanted to step back just to comment on a couple of the other things that have been mentioned too. First of all, there's the inevitable sort of techno-optimist question. What is the sort of continuum and the range between the sort of responsible techno-optimist and the sort of techno-utopian that is really sort of imagining that tech will solve the world? And I think that this can sometimes boil down to almost a sort of futile debate where we really need to understand that there are tremendous benefits that technologies are going to bring and that we're going to need them to bring, but that we also need to be savvy and sensitive to some of the risks they could bring. And I think that kind of more mature conversation is starting to be seen, including in public policy circles where we're talking about technology governance, where we're talking about questions like differential technological development. How do we really push the things that we're certain are going to be of benefit? And how do we, put a bit more skepticism and a little bit more thought around some of the ones that could bring the greater risks? So I think that that's really an important frame to bring forward. I guess just one of the other questions I wanted to raise is, just we are on the cusp, in some ways, of potentially reaching this an abundant society, a post-scarcity society in various domains. We're going to see this more and more in various areas. We've just seen it now in the area of generating images and art, in fact, through AI. It's transforming that whole industry, and we'll see that playing out in the coming months and years. There's a lot of reflection that of course, companies are going to need to make, but also societies will as well. And I'd like to touch just finally on the distributional question there, just to get because we've talked about growing the pie and what does wealth look like, but there's this crucial question about who has the access to all of these important elements of well-being in the future. And one of just to get a little technical for a moment, we understand that we think of inequalities as coming from differences in wages, but actually, as many of you know, a large part of inequality is driven by the difference between the sort of return to capital and the return to labor. And right now, there's an understanding that, in fact, the capital share of increasing growth and productivity is likely to rise exponentially under the kind of technological developments we've seen. It becomes less and less important, what you're doing as an individual human in contributing at work and what you're making in a salary. It's really capital that's generating this massive productivity explosion, and the returns are going there. And I think when that happens, it really requires us to question some of our assumptions that we've had about the appropriate distribution measures for this, both within our societies and, crucially, across societies. Because if we don't consider some of those questions, we could find ourselves in a very unfortunate hyper-concentration of value right at a time when we're, in fact, trying to move in opposite ways, and we've got the potential to build a sort of very broadly prosperous society.
I think one of the things that I'm hearing here, and is maybe quite an important point, is even as we think about defining value for the future, each of you have addressed the foundational question of how do we make sure that there's a transformation in who participates in that economic future, in that well-being future. Whether it's because of technological concentration and skill, whether because of the idea that there is a generational shift that will have to happen, and because there is a foundational kind of reimagining of equity. This is the world that we face where, we can talk about utopian views of a well-being and wealth-driven future, but there's a mechanism by which we have to get there. Joe, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to ask the same question to each of our speakers over the next couple of minutes before we go to our audience for questions. You've shared with us things like NFTs and blockchain. Duncan, you've spoken about this new kind of emerging field of creating AI-driven art. But these are still quite speculative as technologies, right? They're still quite limited in use. I wonder if you can take us through kind of what you each see as the one kind of emerging trend today that defines a low-friction pathway to the future, right?
It's a great question. So there's a few ways that I think about this, and there's one in particular that I'm not sure if it's low friction, completely, totally low friction, but it's getting there. It's just a matter of time before that happens. And I love what they've both been describing because it's really about well-being. It's about wealth, and I think hand in hand they can do tremendous things. I mean, from a community and purpose for the greater good. And one technology that will help us get there, in my personal opinion, though it's early days, and you all have either read about this, you maybe heard about it at this conference, or maybe it's new to you. That is a DAO, so a decentralized autonomous organization, right? And the way that I like to describe it, if it's new to you, is that it's essentially like the new version of a business, but it's stored on the blockchain. So you're leveraging the blockchain to create a system that allows for people, anybody around the world, to create communities around a concept or an idea. It could be something totally for money, where you want to buy a football team in Europe, and you say, let's buy Manchester United. And you get as many people as you want together, create this DAO, which is stored on the blockchain. Each person that wants to participate would get tokens in their digital wallet that prove that they actually have access to this. And then they can vote on things. So they come up with proposals. Anybody that's part of this DAO can come up with proposals. Very egalitarian. So the idea being that anybody can come up with an idea, and then people can actually vote on that using their tokens to prove that they want to do that. Maybe it's who they draft, right? So that's one goofy example, but it's a legitimate example that we'll see over the course of the next several years. Probably even better suited to what your question directly asked is, What if we started to see DAOs for governments? That is, communities that say, you know what, I love what our government's doing in whatever part of the world, but let's get a group of 500 people in our village to get together and create a DAO where we can actually vote on things, we can propose things, and you can prove what's happening. People have a vested interest in that. They can actually see how things are being voted on, and they can propose new ideas. All of that is enabled by these DAOs, which I think is fantastic to be able to see.
Amazing. You're making an equivalency between financial wealth, between participation, and now governance. That mechanism, whether it's DAOs or something else, that lets people have greater political voice.
Exactly.
Excellent. Dr. Roth, a comment on this is kind of what are the kind of emerging trends or institutions or mechanisms that you see that might get us to the future?
I mean, speaking from the world of knowledge, I think any technology that enables us to create relevant knowledge as fast as possible. Maybe it's like mining, knowledge mining, to work to co-create together on solutions for certain challenges. I think that's the technology that we want to see, which is very connected to what you said, to DAO, but it's also very connected, obviously, to how do we finance then these kind of solutions that we would have identified. I think this is one of the biggest problems that we see in developing countries, access to finance to actually execute ideas. So that's something that we need technologies for that. And I think the third area, and this comes more from my background in healthcare and digital health, is probably a movement towards personal ownership of data and health data, so that you can actually monetize this kind of data. So in my early days, 2014 and so on, I was dreaming of the health book. Everyone would have their entire health data, and then in one file, and then could actually monetize that, sell this or use it for other purposes, but it's actually owned by the individual. And of course, it would also require a certain level of education to understand what this health data actually means for oneself. I think this brings us back to how do we make sure that all these technology evolutions and advances and innovations are made so that we can use them well. And I think this brings us back to good choice architecture. I think by birth, we are all born to be good people and contribute to society, and then there are some obstacles in the world which maybe inhibit us to do so. So I think creating the right choice architecture, and this is the role of all of us here as futurists, but especially of governments, to ensure that every human being can contribute to the society they are in, is what all these technologies should actually do.
Excellent. Duncan?
I think I would just go back and highlight artificial intelligence again. I know you may be jaded. You've heard a lot of hype about this over the last decades, but I would encourage us all to continue to pay attention, or pay renewed attention. The experts I've been talking to, many of whom are at the sort of cutting edge of this field, are themselves astounded at some of the recent pace and progress. And it's particularly interesting because it's not being predictable. It doesn't sort of follow a necessarily linear curve. There used to be sort of a question, someone would say, okay, these large language models, they can do some cool things, but all these AIs, they're very narrowly focused. They can just sort of do one thing. Come and tell me when that's not the case. And well, it's turned out that some of the techniques that have gone into making AI more powerful at particularly narrow tasks are also leading it to be particularly capable at broader tasks. And we're seeing now that I believe it's one of the large language models that not only is able to do a fantastic job of suggesting the next sentence to you, but it is also able to code, and it is also able to control a robot in physical space. And so we're seeing that kind of broader generalization of these capabilities too. Still uncertain just how quickly this would roll out in different areas, but I think it is definitely one that deserves our further attention. And almost in any area that you are a specialist in, start thinking about what some of the overlaps, the intersections, and the linkages could be. And I guess really prioritizing some of the safety side around this, because I think there is an imbalance that probably needs to be corrected. There's tremendous amount of talent and ingenuity going into pushing these as fast as we can to see how far we can get, both because it could be productive and because, admit it, it's cool. There's not much attention into the equally important, potentially more urgent task of really making sure that we've got all of the safety mechanisms in place so that these AIs that we have now don't align with individual or societal human intentions. How do we get better at doing that, both at a technical perspective and then also in terms of legitimate decision-making about what we should in fact be seeking from these technologies? So that would be my one to pay attention to right now.
Universal across these answers, and I think is so values representative, is each of you have spoken about a way of enabling better individual agency and shared decision making, that the future of wealth isn't necessarily about any specific intervention. It is about a fundamental reconstruction of how we participate in defining that future. I want to thank you for that, very inspiring. We have a few minutes for questions from our audience, and I think we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask you maybe to introduce yourself very quickly and give us a brief question. We'll do brief answers and we'll try to get through a couple of these. I think we have some folks in the audience with microphones. Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I am Deza Camilo. I am an investor, and I have some business related with fintech. And I own an accelerator in South America. And my question is related with something that you said already. There is an Arabic word, and just correct me if I'm wrong, it's istidama, means sustainability. One of the biggest challenge today for the startups and for entrepreneurship spirit is that we are looking for unicorns and this kind of gig economy, okay? And there is a criticism about this model because all your generation, they want to be rich like that. And we are not thinking about sustainability in terms of wealth. So now there is a new concept named, we don't want to be unicorns anymore. We want to be camels. The camels will survive in the desert. The camels will, for longer life. So my question for you guys, for Joseph, for example, I love your socks, by the way. It's how do you see the concept of sustainability in the ecosystem in terms of entrepreneurship? Because I think that they are part of this, economical movement that will lead, the wealth in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Joe, maybe to you. I think the fundamental question there is the idea of fast growth, aggregation of value versus longer-term sustainable businesses and technologies.
That is really a tough question, honestly, because the focus really is on looking at the most rapidly developed concepts and ideas. I think if we think about the bigger picture of how many people around the world will now have access to tools that they never had before, it's still going to be a race to what's the best concept, what's the best idea, what resonates for people in those communities. So how do you do that? I think it's driving forward the idea of building the community that opens the door for people of all cultures, all ideas to get together, share those ideas, and whatever resonates, whatever makes the most sense, they will bubble to the top. And it's in the concepts of the ideas of the people that are actually looking through these things to say, well, is this something that's sustainable? Is this something we should continue to focus like on the camel mentality? That's where they have to start to make those decisions at that point in time, but it's fostering that, yeah.
Thanks, Joe. Anybody else? Or we can go back to the audience. Maybe back to the audience. Let's try to get some more questions.
One point there, which is interesting, right? We also, ADB, set up an ADB venture fund to actually help with venture capital in the venture poor area in Asia. And I think the challenge is always, are we looking for financial sustainability and business models that survive and that meet the current trends and needs, or are we looking for sustainability in a environment, climate, social sustainability aspect, right? And I think we are in a space right now where there's a lot of experimentation on how do we achieve convergence and how do we know how to also nudge convergence, right? And that links to the right policies, the right financial instruments, the right kind of mindsets, and people are working on that. And probably we haven't found the secret sauce yet, and we need a lot more experimentation to see sustainability financially, making money, and sustainability for social governance and environmental aspects. So I think that is the most exciting space right now. Again, we need a lot of knowledge for that and manage that kind of knowledge.
Amazing. Thank you. Very good. Maybe here in front, if there's a microphone, folks. Oh, sorry, in the back. Go ahead. All right. Then we'll try to come to you as well.
I'm from the Bayan newspaper. This is governmental newspaper. Our talk today is how to define wealth differently. But in the same context, why ask you why we have this forum? This forum why announced new perception of wealth. GMP, gross metaverse products. The replacement of GDP. So my question is, this perception, GMP, gross metaverse product, is viable? If it is, how?
Thank you. I'm going to broaden the aperture of this question a bit. I think what you're speaking to is, are there technologies that are going to totally reframe GDP? The question was about the gross metaverse product. Duncan, I might come to you to see if you have a kind of a broader kind of aperture on the answer here.
Well, actually, pause my microphone a second while I clear my... Excuse me. I'm fascinated by metaverse, but by no means an expert. But I do think that you're raising a really fascinating question, and I think it was mentioned by Her Excellency this morning as well, that we actually need to be seeing the metaverse, however this manifests itself, and I'm not, this beyond any proprietary space that certain companies may think that they have in this world. I think that the development of highly immersive online worlds where we are participating in, where we're spending increasing portions of our life and our lives in all aspects, in education, in socializing, in work, and so forth, I think that is a very likely part of our growing part in our future. And that really means that some of the questions as public policymakers and also as entrepreneurs that we're thinking about in the real world, in the physical world, I should say, need to be thought through very differently in the metaverse. There's some that are easily transposable. There are others that look quite different when you're in a world where the rules of physics don't work in the same way, or of time for that matter, just to begin with. So I think it is certainly worth understanding that what happens in that space will be highly relevant to individual well-being and indeed to collective well-being, and that means it's not that it is actually a very important area for public policy to consider and not to sort of be blind to that space.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think it brings up much bigger questions, and that is about citizenship in the metaverse. It's about national borders. Won't there be borders? And that will define how we measure any wealth creation in the metaverse, right? And also what kind of values will we actually bring to the metaverse. If you think about it, why are we even thinking about metaverse? Maybe one reason is also that we believe that we can spend our time a lot more efficient there. I think a lot of people spend their time or aren't able to spend their time very efficiently in this world if you think about the time they need to just fulfill their basic needs, right? So I think that's where, again, it comes back to how do we create an environment where people can have more and better ideas to actually create better societies. If it's the metaverse or the hereverse, it doesn't really matter.
Amazing.
I could spend an hour on this. I know you talks on metaverse,
yeah.
so I'll just say one or two quick things, and that is that, 10 years from now, we're all going to be living in the metaverse. There's no question about it. Some people say, I don't know about that. The technology is coming. The devices, Apple should be coming out in the next 12 to 18 months, the device such. But what's going to be crazy is you will be able to develop whatever you want to look like. And you think about your own well-being. Do you want that? Do we want that? We have to think about those types of things. So it's a great question. How do you measure that? Yet to be determined, but it's something we really have to start thinking about.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Great. I'd love to come here down to the front. If we can have do you have a question? Maybe we'll come here and then we'll try to come over. We'll try to fit both in. Anybody got a microphone down? Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Hala Al-Khatib. I'm an employee in Dubai government in the air navigation field. When talking, first, thank you very much for this session. I really enjoyed all the conversation, all the new ideas that has been brought to the table. My question is, when we talk about wealth in the future, definitely we're talking about a segment that is currently employed. This is as a sort of wealth, not that employees are wealthy, but it is a source of wealth currently for people. Now with the technology advancement, with the artificial intelligence coming to replace many jobs, or let's say human tedious jobs, many people will be left with no skills and no jobs. So my question to you, what do you think the government should be doing to support this people in the future? What should be changed now, either in terms of skilling these people, creating new jobs, and what load it will impact the government if not?
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. I think we may have to call that our last question, but what I'd like to do with our speakers is, why don't you comment on this and maybe give us some closing thoughts as we come down. I'll also encourage each of you to share how the audience can engage with you for further conversation, if you have social media or other things you'd like to share as well. Duncan, maybe we'll start with you and come down the line.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you, and thank you for that final question as well. I think it's an excellent one. Of course, there aren't simple answers to this. We know that there will be a huge amount of disruption, and one of the first things we can do is at least sort of acknowledge that and begin to prepare for that more. I do think that the one positive lining on this is that if we see the amount of disruption that we potentially could around, the number of tasks, the number of jobs that are essentially automated as advances in technology continue, that will be generating it'll only happen if it's generating massive productivity gains. This is happening because it can increase the wealth, increase the goods and services that are offered, that are available. So it really then does become a distributional question. And I think, obviously there are concepts such as the universal basic income going around, and there's probably a larger part for those. Many of you will be familiar with the arguments, but that's not the only thing, of course, that one can do as one is trying to find policy measures to help the effects of this on the population. And there is still a lot of room to be done in the sort of broader suite of job training, but that it goes beyond just sort of training for specific jobs, but building that kind of broader resilience. A lot of those things are actually quite aligned with the sort of things that we also want to do to help people achieve their well-being. People who are better mental health, better generally off in their well-being, are more likely to be productive and adaptable under a range of circumstances too. So a lot of these things sort of come together. I guess my final words would just be to encourage you all to, as futurists, to bring your practice to the most important issues. I've never met an issue that didn't require or wouldn't have benefited from the application of foresight, but we are in a very interesting and a very important time in human history. And I think it's going to need all of our talents and all of our efforts deployed on really the most important questions for public policy, for our societies. I think there's a crucial role that all of you can bring in that exercise, really to helping us think proactively about the future, to be challenging some of our assumptions and asking ourselves the important questions, the uncomfortable questions that don't always get asked about where do we really want to be heading, what are we shooting for, what is well-being look like to us. So I encourage you all in that. Any of you who would like to be in touch with us at the OECD and become involved in some of the global foresight initiatives that we're leading, I certainly encourage you to reach out to us. You can look up OECD Foresight, and then the simplest way to reach us is at foresight@oecd.org. That's simple.
Awesome, Duncan. We're over time, so give us the Twitter version, 160 characters or less, and your social media, and we'll try to do this quick.
Okay, so first point, automation. I think we have to think about where we automate to become more efficient or more productive or really create more innovation, right? And that requires investment in education and skills development. So maybe that to your point. So be more deliberate about what gets automated and where we use artificial intelligence or not. So it has to be regulated in that sense. I think the next point, coming back on how do we change the system, and maybe this is back to the gentleman's question about the metaverse is we have an opportunity to actually measure what we value, right? So we can change the system now. It's all, sorry to say it, man-made. Women did not participate much in the world we created, in the financial architecture we have. Yeah, so we have a fantastic opportunity now to change what we measure, and that is we recreate what we actually value.
Fantastic, thank you.
And I'll just leave with one quote. 90% of the jobs that exist in 10 years from now don't exist today. So there's an immense amount of opportunity ahead.
Amazing, I love the optimism. Thank you all. We've scratched the surface of a very deep conversation today. Thank you all for your engagement. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
If you'd like to continue the conversation, I'm at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation at Velocity. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Thank you. Oh my gosh, amazing.